Hello, welcome to the FORSEA Dialogue on Democratic Struggles Across Asia series. I'm Zani, the host of this dialogue series. And today I have invited a very prominent international law practitioner and the director of Human Rights Center at the University of Ottawa in Canada and endowed chair Neuberger Jessen Endowed Chair in Conflict Resolution, Professor John Packer. Professor Packer is on a visit to UK to talk about Uyghur persecution by China, and today he will shed light on a very timely and crucial issue of whether or not the United Nations will grant recognition to the popularly mandated national unity government, the parallel government fighting against the brutal military regime in Burma. Professor Packer, thank you for coming on this dialogue series.
Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Zarni, for the invitation to meet with you and to have this conversation, which, as you say, is very timely. Really, the prospect this is a matter of speculation, and on the basis of empirical evidence, the conduct of states at the United Nations, it's very hard to reach a conclusion because, unfortunately, the experience in the United Nations has been nothing but inconsistent. And so we have completely contradictory experiences at the United Nations in terms of decisions with regard, for example, to credentials of persons to take the seat and therefore hold the authority to represent the state. And there has been some writing on this recently, a rather arcane kind of committee and processes that normally gets no attention whatsoever suddenly becomes quite relevant. In most cases, of course, not only the state as such is relatively self-evident. The penumbra of the state may be in dispute, the exact border, membership of certain populations, and so forth. But the states are relatively self-evident. There is a law on the definition of the state, and so forth. And actually, in this case, by the way, the state as such is not in dispute. There's no question about does Myanmar exist, or Burma, even if you want to call it something else. So essentially the defined territory, the permanent population. The responsibility of the state is accepted, and there's no doubt that Myanmar is a member of the United Nations. The question is who speaks with the authority of that state. Normally that derives from the effective government. The international law definition of the state is that it also comprises an effective government. Effectiveness there means not only with regard to the territory and the population of the state, but vitally in terms of its relations with other states, this community of states. And that depends on something called recognition, because other states will choose to engage and to conduct these relations or not. And that has enormous implications, both legally, materially, and so forth. But as I say, unfortunately, the actual practice is not consistent. Now, that being said, there are standards which should apply to this. And if we apply those standards, we should, by deduction, reach some conclusion. Again, I qualify that by saying this is not always the case. If we apply those standards, then we would say, first of all, who is this junta? Who are anybody to suddenly show up? I mean, can you and me just show up at the UN or anywhere else and say we represent? I mean, there must be some evidentiary basis that we have some material relationship where we're not imposters, right?
Yeah.
So in this case, the junta, essentially the Tatmadaw, are asserting their forcible position and a narrative of legitimacy. They claim this has some legality behind it and so forth. But that needs to be tested against the actual standard. The standard is not that they say so. The standard is a few things. First of all, there is the Charter of the United Nations. And second of all, there are, even before the Charter, general international law standards, the first of which is the effectiveness of that purported government. Does it have effective control? Is it reliable? And there we have to acknowledge that I dare say neither the National Unity Government nor the junta can demonstrate a fully effective control. I would say nobody has fully effective control of the full state of Myanmar. Yeah. But that's one. And just to finish the set, the other two elements there are the norm that the authority must derive from the will of the people. That is not only a standard of international law, but is the kind of justification for that authority. And there it's, I would say, quite clear that the junta definitely does not enjoy that. It doesn't even have any basis to purport it. Yeah. And the National Unity Government has both a domestic legal basis, it may be stretched in some regard, but it really exists, and they have an actual demonstrated experience, an election, which supports them. We can talk more about this, but on that basis, normatively, the prospect for the NUG should be greater than for the junta, but again, the actual practice of states is inconsistent.
Professor Pecker, as you know, the United Nations Credential Committee is reportedly meeting next week or sometime this month, according to the Voice of America news report. And they will be discussing the contentious issue of who should be seated at the United Nations as representative of the member state of Myanmar. The two contending parties are National Unity Government, popularly mandated through elections and minority support, and the brutal Burmese military regimes. So what, in your opinion, are prospects for the NUG being recognized as the legitimate representative of Myanmar as a member state?
There are experiences and examples which would support that this is why I say terribly inconsistent performance of the United Nations. So there are examples which would support the completely different conclusions, either the junta or, in this case, two competing options. So we could imagine more, okay, the two, and the National Unity Government. And I'll give you some examples on that in a moment. But first of all, let's be clear. There is no actual law of precedence. So whatever the General Assembly, the committee has done in the past is not binding in the sense that they must follow. There are principles they should follow, but states are sovereign and they may decide at any time, and they will always argue that each situation is unique. And in certain measure, every situation is unique. So that notion of precedent only tells us that it is possible it could go either way. And I will tell you what I think will happen in a moment. But let us go back to this. There are substantive elements and there are procedural elements. So just to stay with the procedural element, first of all, there was and remains, in my view, the ambassador accredited from the recognized state and then government of Myanmar, sitting at the United Nations. Exactly. He did not resign. And the question would be for him to be withdrawn. Who has the authority to withdraw? So this is almost a chicken and egg problem. Procedurally, he cannot be withdrawn by you or me showing up saying withdraw him. There must be that recognition. Yeah, but they tried to kill him. But my point being, until there is a legitimate authority to withdraw him, the status quo procedurally persists. So in principle, he should be seated unless and until he is legitimately withdrawn. That's a procedural matter.
On the UN member states,
indeed,
not to accept the alternative.
Absolutely. So at that moment, it's not just he's a guy off the street or some ordinary Burmese citizen. Right. He is the accredited, recognized spokesperson for Burma, Myanmar, at the United Nations, enjoying the recognized status and protected as such in diplomatic law and so forth. Yeah. So his words are not any words. his words were the words pro forma of the state. In other words, whatever you thought about the substance, you had to acknowledge that that's was his position. He was the legitimate guy. It is already, in my view, procedurally problematic to suddenly ignore that person on the pretension of some other people who have yet to demonstrate or been acknowledged. So this is a procedural question, and I think state with the scrutiny, if this was all in a back room and no one knew, they could easily kind of ignore it. With the scrutiny, I think the United Nations will be loath to simply ignore that because it raises many other questions. But let us now link that with the substantive question. So the substantive question is essentially three norms that apply to this. And they are not equal in validity. They are three, and they may have different measured significance. Historically and in general international law, even the very definition of the state, this effectiveness of authority, is constitutive of the state.
How do you explain that?
Yeah, so it's really the effective power, the essential power to determine. This is not about justice or rule of law in a kind of a nice sense. It is the hard reality, the rubber hitting the road of control. Right. So the fundamental principle in all international relations between states is control. And because international
control of
the territory and population, because international relations can't function if whatever its theoretical construction is, it is divorced from hard fact on the ground. Right. So now, that being said, so let me just say the three basic elements are effective control, effectiveness generally, and by the way, as a legal norm, effectiveness of law with regard to territory, population, so forth. Doesn't mean anything. The second is this new notion, only since really 1945 in the UN Charter, that the legitimacy of authority of that, because historically, for time immemorial, however I got that control was nobody's business. I could take it through the use of force. I could conquer. I could be colonial. I could really. It was just a hard reality that I got control. I could commit genocide, and I could still. So there's no other kind of constraint on it. Progressively, we added constraints. But in the United Nations Charter, they added this other idea of legitimacy of that authority not being just control, also being about the source of that authority deriving from popular will, the will of the people.
The population.
Those who are governed, who are subject to the authority. And the second, and that idea was made even more explicit in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 21, which explicitly says that the will of the authority of government shall derive from the people. The authority of government shall derive from the will of the people. And more specifically, this is the Universal Declaration of Rights, but that was elaborated as giving content, specificity to the UN Charter. So it's linked. It's not any declaration. It's a principal declaration on human rights of the Charter. I'll come back to the link in a moment. And Article 21 doesn't even tell us this norm, the will of the people, substantively, but is to be expressed through periodic elections. So they even tell us how you know this will of the people, procedurally elections. So that becomes, it doesn't become superior to effective control, it becomes a second norm, coterminous, okay? And now the problem is where these would be in clash, right? Not consistent. There's a third norm. And the third norm, which is in Article 55 of the UN Charter, and I would say from the purposes of the Charter as such, is that the use of authority of government is not for any purpose, certainly not to cause harm to other states and other persons, and not just for the enrichment of a few people or whatever bizarre enterprise they may seek. The legitimate use of authority must be for contributing to social and economic development of that country and population, and more explicitly in Article 55, the well-being of the population. So we can look at now, we have to look at these contenders from these three simultaneous correlated norms. The problem, and to go back to your question about precedent, we know, and I'll give you a concrete example. You mentioned the Khmer Rouge, but I'll give you an example of Bosnia and Herzegovina in the early 1990s when Yugoslavia dissolved. And there was recognized, and there was a whole question about the newly independent states of the former Yugoslavia,
Just 6 of them.
which followed this idea, a norm, and there was the Badinter Commission from France, from the head of the Constitutional Court, and they followed this idea that the drawn territorial units, the administrative units that comprised Yugoslavia, would be sovereign, independent, following a principle called uti possidetis juris, which is that you follow the possession in law and you simply transfer recognition.
Yeah.
So Bosnia-Herzegovina became a state. Now the question was, who represented the state? And you'll remember there was this guy named Izetbegovic and so forth. Well, who represented? Well, the United Nations granted recognition. And you might also remember a guy named Mohammed Sasser. And he was the ambassador given recognition and seated at the United Nations. He actually, I think he was born in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but he grew up in New York City. He had a thick, I can't remember if it was Bronx or Brooklyn accent, New York. Guy was a New Yorker, right?
Right.
What I want you to pay attention to is at that moment, Bosnia and Herzegovina had zero effective control. So they were granted recognition, not only the state, but also the government without, it wasn't an over, without effective.
So this is that one condition was
This essential condition from time immemorial, what was set aside for the, I would say, efficaciousness of the international relations. The other states wanted somebody to deal with, and they acknowledged and they recognized that they can do that. They can do that. And obviously they weren't governing. They had no effective control, and they were. So I give that example as one far end of the spectrum. You can have a recognized government in the absence of effective control at all. I mean, that's the same theory that applied to the Baltic states throughout the whole Cold War, is that they never ceased to exist. They were occupied on long duration occupation. They were even incorporated and represented, not just Yalta, but Potsdam Agreement. But constitutionally, that's why the Baltic states are not considered newly independent. They are considered restored sovereignty, and their diplomacy continued. They issued passports, birth certificates throughout the whole period. So this notion of who is the state can have that kind of far end. So it's possible we could imagine NUG with zero effective control and not governing at all, just in terms of some legitimacy on that first plank, normative plank. It would be very strange, on the other hand, at this state of history, to accept effective control in contradiction of the other two norms. Not only that you have no demonstrated will of the people, but in the face of the current circumstance of the junta, manifestly not pursuant to the will of the people, that becomes a problem. And you're governing against their interests. You are causing damage. So here, the precedent question is, yes, there are examples where the United Nations has simply accepted that, but to do this in the light of day in 2021 with these contradictions will be a major issue of the normative legitimacy of the United Nations itself. How can they do this?
The United Nations is a morally loaded terminology or name for this world body. You and I just visited Winston Churchill's house, and one exhibit caption caught my attention, where Churchill, wrote about nations of the world united against the evil, the fascism. The nations from left and rightist ideological spectrums, like Soviets and the prototype of the Western Bloc, the liberal democracies, uniting against this evil. There is a moral underpinning to this, and now the UN has been behaving as if only geopolitics matter and there is no moral force behind its um, stances and decisions or undecisions in cases like Burma or other extremely disturbing international cases. How do you think the UN is performing here as judge against its original mission of the pursuit or defense of the moral world?
So I agree with that, but I would be a little bit more pragmatic. The moral imperative was at the time and still today driven by interest. So basically, fascism. This was revealed in terms of the naivete of Chamberlain, the idea that it wasn't going to affect you, and what they did. I forget his phrase. People we hardly know in far off lands. The reference to the Czechoslovak situation. People. Well, of course, it wasn't true. Neville Chamberlain, 1938. So he came back from the Munich Security Conference, and Hitler had promised him nothing would happen. We're just domestically dealing with these things, and Chamberlain bought it. And of course, it was manifestly ridiculous, and it proved very quickly to be utter nonsense. What we know, and what was demonstrated not just through the Second World War, but what we know in the complex, interdependent world we live in today, with COVID and all these other things, climate change, is that these United Nations, the moral basis of uniting is because they share real interest, substantive interest in their own well-being. Because what goes on in another place really does affect them. I mean, what we've just seen in Afghanistan, the whole story of 9/11, which is coming up in a couple of days, the 20th anniversary, is kind of absurd. How people in literally the other side of the world somehow had a direct effect through the two airplanes, or more than two airplanes on 9/11 and so forth. So we are connected. COVID makes it even more connected. So we have to ask ourselves, and when I say we, I don't mean just the states. I mean global society, as to say, what is our interest in the kind of pretension of, for example, a junta? We could say we ignore it and they do as they like through whatever means. It comes at a cost. Our real interest is that there is a parallels, not just moral in the sense of the kind of popular notion of morality as kind of being nice. I mean the deep connectivity between right conduct and decent living, even survival, turns on the relationship. So it's not just about effectiveness of this control. It is the quality of that effectiveness, because it is a peril to us if that control is used for nefarious and deleterious purposes that injure not just that population, but inevitably injure us. I mean, the Rohingya is a perfect example of this, because it's not like they went nowhere. I mean, if I'm the Bangladeshi government, and many other places, there's 250,000 of them in Malaysia, and so on. And what it means is the world is supposed to just pick up the responsibility of, in this case, as many as 2.5 million. It's not just 1.5 million in Bangladesh. There's like 2.5 million Rohingya around the world that basically Myanmar has washed their hands of. That's a consequence. That's a consequence for all of us. I mean, I pay taxes as a Canadian taxpayer because this junta did that. Absolutely. But we could do many other things with that money. Why should? Absolutely. So think about the opportunity cost of all of that. So again, what contemporary international law says, not just the relations, we are interrelated, but actually says, no, look, not only you can't do this stuff, but you're supposed to be using those resources and that power for essentially constructive purposes. A Canadian shouldn't be paying taxes to feed. The Rohingya can feed themselves if your government effectively governs according to law. Dr. Zani, this is precisely right. And so there's another fundamental norm in this, which is about the use of force. And so it's not just, we must ask ourselves why the National Unity Government even exists. It is because it has been deprived of precisely the effective control that followed from the demonstrated will of the population, with its shortcomings. We're not being naive in this, and these things are not black and white. But what happened? There was a coup, a military coup, explicitly contrary to the Constitution. So there's no domestic law justification, clearly with these negative consequences internationally. So there's no legitimacy other than brute force from there's no other legitimacy from the junta. But we have to understand that if the international community were to essentially positively sanction the junta, they are now disregarding another fundamental norm, which is the use of force with regard to the political legitimacy of control, which means, what happened on January 6th in Washington. And it would mean the same in London, and it would mean the same conceptually of the SS, which were only ever a limited number, whatever they were, 8,000 members or whatever, and so on. You don't need a lot. And we know that there are a number of countries where you have very small groups who have, through brutal usurpation of resources and power, and so it becomes highly problematical if this is essentially sanctioned, positively sanctioned, and the whole international community is going to have to consider this. I think at its cost, and that's the thing, is right now there's a sober moment.
Taking a different angle, looking at the U.S. and U.K. government reportedly, considering or showing signs that they would accept the Burmese militaries and nominated representatives as the country representatives in Washington and London. When the news came out that might be the case, the rationale from these governments, or particularly the UK government side so far, is that they are not recognizing the brutal regime, but they are recognizing the state. So how do they justify presenting this farce or farcical notion of a state, while ignoring the very regime that they have sanctioned for crimes against humanity, brutality, and other international crimes, although they don't recognize the Burmese regime's crime as genocide? How can they work with this farcical notion or separation between state and regimes?
So it is farcical, and here is the complexity of the interests of states. Right. So of course the United Kingdom, like Canada, there are corporate interests, there are invested interests, there are concerns. We see this, I think, in sharp relief right now in Afghanistan. The argument being that we don't like the Taliban. 20 years ago we considered them and actually sanctioned them on lists of terrorists and so forth. At the same time, we need someone to talk to. Argument. By the way, in Afghanistan, the vice president says, "I'm still here. I'm the vice president. Talk to us." There were problematical aspects of this in terms of effectiveness of control, but also in kind of real power. If you're going to ignore the Taliban and so on, I understand it's not clear, but I believe the squaring of irreconcilable things is now increasingly evident. And now the challenge really is twofold. One is how closer to consistency can one be with regard to application of principle? The reason for that is we need predictability. For any kind of relationship, we need a degree of reliability, credibility. If we have no, if we are continually, utterly inconsistent, I have no basis to rely. I can't foresee conduct. So why would I invest? I mean, it can be, these are issues with a number of states right now, because, for instance, the way China is conducting itself with regard to corporate interests. I mean, you can invest billions and find yourself suddenly out of luck.
This one.
Yeah. So this is the problem. I'm with due respect to the foreign secretary here in this country. I have to say they're either willfully blind in the sense of ignoring the manifest duplicity of their positions, or they haven't thought them through, because they're going to find themselves in stupid situations. I mean, they are now with consequences. So, for example, if they will have to figure out how do they argue one situation regarding the Taliban and a completely different situation regarding the other thing I want to emphasize here, though, is there is a tendency as a result of Magnitsky Acts and things like that, to what I call bad appleism. To say, well, it's not just the government, or it's not a state recognition. This is a government. Who do we deal with? Right. Question. They say, well, it's not like the armed forces as a whole is bad. Well, armed forces, we have armed forces. They're not necessarily bad, defensive. Not for all 400,000 members of the Tatmadaw are evil, and so forth. So it's a simple kind of sleight of hand to say there's a few bad apples here, which we won't deal with individually. We put them on notice that they might even be, tried in some place, God knows when, God knows how. But it allows us to pursue our interests in terms of continuing the relationship and so forth. Now, that, I think, is dodging the harsh reality.
Well, it's itself. I mean, the state recognition.
So it is also a dodge in this respect. So what materially happens as a consequence of this is they would say, well, we're not selling our arms to the general person who is evil and been sanctioned. We sell it to the state. And who's the contracted party in negotiating? Well, we find some acceptable, legitimate face, and we deal with them, the ambassador and so forth. This is so more than deceitful. This is actually fraudulent. This is misrepresented. And in fact, what they're really doing is they're continuing to not just through this fiction of the separation of the state and the government, they are actually still supporting the regime, the system, which, and here this is very important to focus on state responsibility, because it's not, a number of these generals, including Meng Lao, have not, I don't think it is asserted that he has personally raped or killed. He's given orders, right? He's been responsible. So, exactly right. So this is what I'm saying, is there's a kind of fiction going on here. But more precisely, my point is that actually in a lot of this conduct, nobody individually did some of these things. It was the state in the system which this government has constructed. And by the way, that's considered usually a sovereign matter. The state may decide what form of government, what is it, centralized, the federation or whatever. So if they have a system that, for example, deprives Rohingya of nationality, that act of deprivation of nationality was not a single individual. It was the state, but it was a state under this regime. And this is where I think it's quite important. It's a little bit abstract, and it's difficult for many ordinary people to kind of get their head around. We want to see the face of the individuals, but actually it is the regime. And this is where there are problems with the National Unity Government, and why it matters what the National Unity Government has been saying about policy, about its for example, its position on the citizenship law. This matters because then we can not only adjudge it in terms of the consistency with the norms I talked about before, using the power of the state for good purposes and so forth. But we can start to see, well, what regime would that be? I'm using regime in the sense of system, right? The group. So I think this focus on individual responsibility of a few bad guys is not only deceitful, I call it just a dodge. It's just really dodging the whole thing. And then business as usual can continue.
If you look at the Burmese language media chats and social media tweets and whatnot, there's been a considerable amount of ridiculing of the United Nations, and in my view, rightly. And in many other parts of the world, the United Nations is considered basically a cruel joke, utterly impotent to address any major crisis in the world. And do you think the UN's credibility and legitimacy itself is at stake here in the the conflict or the contention for representation at the UN for the state of Myanmar?
Dr. Zani, this is, you are observing it, in my view, quite clearly. And I think many people are. This is one reason why, for example, the United Nations as such is increasingly losing the confidence of people around the world, that there is a kind of almost existential question here for the United Nations. And I've been recently at conferences where people who normally would support the United Nations are increasingly thinking this doesn't work anymore. Because the inconsistency we're talking about is not just of the states, but so for example, to look precisely at what has been going on since 1st of February in Myanmar, one of the quite surprising, though sensible slogans or calls from the people was for responsibility to protect.
Yes, sir.
And so they're saying, well, we're taking you at your word on this. In 2005 at the summit meeting, 170 heads of state and government agreed to this.
Right. This is under
at the time, but between states.
Yeah.
It was the largest meeting of heads of state and government, I think, ever. And they agreed. And then later, the General Assembly and even the Security Council approved. Even the Security Council approved responsibility to protect. Now, I know we've had inconsistent invocations of it, and frankly, questionable invocations around Libya and so forth, and then later the Russians talking about it in Abkhazia and so forth, because states will manipulate with their own politics. But the people, in terms of the United Nations and this outcome document and the kind of normative assertion under, which should be upheld by the Secretary General, well, reasonably, the people of Myanmar said, we'll call you on that. Where is it? Right? And there has been deafening silence from a lot of the United Nations and institutional organization. A lot of the people I know personally who were actively involved in peace process, involved in democratization process. I want to underline people with professional integrity, but after 1st of February, you cannot with a straight face any longer pretend. And the regime, the junta, explicitly has said, for example, regarding the Rohingya, all that discussion with the trilateral discussions with the Chinese and Bangladesh is all nonsense. We are not taking them back. So there's no longer, the pretensions are all exploded. It doesn't. It's nonsense now. And there's a harsh question in this. Which side are you on? Do you actually support this idea of the popular sovereignty, the will of the people? Do you actually support the use of power, the resources for the good of the people? Or are you part of some kind of global cabal of exploitative, just force of all use? In which case, Zani, this is not just a question for Myanmar today. It's not even a question for contemporary international law. This is like pre-Westphalia. This is going back 400 years.
The United Nations seem to be, still uh, caught in this, outdated international relations framework of the Westphalian order. Can you explain more about that order and why that, you know, the notion that sovereign states can do anything to their own populations as long as, their state behavior does not interrupt the international trade and essentially profit-making processes, around the world.
I mean, there was a kind of complex interdependent world even in 1648, in the Westphalian context. That's why there was the Peace of Westphalia. But today it's inescapable.
Yeah. It's continuing, I would argue, both intellectually and morally, this guided the framework of this statement that continues to form in cultural culture.
Yeah. Well, the premise of the state, which has existed from time immemorial, really some form of the state, the progress of the time in Westphalia, because you had these perpetual wars. Remember, like European kingdoms, and there was one republic in the Dutch Republic, but there was at that time, we lived essentially short, brutish lives, and for a century there was war. I mean, people are worried about 20 years of war in Afghanistan. It was a century plus the 70 years. So we had two long, mainly religious wars, with large parts of the population living brutish lives, and no victory. And I don't know what the social context was, but the kind of epiphany of Westphalia was to realize this was not going to result in an ultimate solution. So they simply negotiated what became this principle of public international law, which is sovereign equality. So all the little kings who were divine and they got together and said, okay, we'll acknowledge we're still divine in our own context, but we will acknowledge your divinity, and the deal here is that we're equally sovereign. Yeah. And there were a little tiny bit of margin on that with some religious minorities and a little bit of order, so that you couldn't just letters of marque were prohibited. You couldn't just grab goods on the high sea and so forth by a sovereign state giving a letter of permission to some vessel. So in order to protect trade, mutuality of trade. So that was the deal. Okay. Now, of course, it became unreliable as long as use of force was basically exploited nonetheless, and industrialized and so forth. And we lived through it. The European context was basically in the 19th century and the early 20th century. So the Westphalia was affirmed in the Charter of the United Nations, the state and essential sovereignty, but it was conditioned by two really, I would say, revolutionary elements. One was the prohibition of the use of force to settle disputes. This is the ultimate element. And the second was human rights, saying that it does matter what you do inside your territory and that you are not unlimited in your effectiveness with regard to population, and not just about foreigners, diplomatically. I mean, your own.
Right.
And so this is human rights. These two revolutionary elements. Yeah. What has happened since then and makes this kind of complex interdependence even more escapable is that we could nonetheless, from 1945 on, sort of ignore what was going on in Biafra. We could be morally outraged, but it didn't touch us so much. We could ignore what happened in East Pakistan in 1971. All those things didn't really touch us. So they breached the norm, but they were not consequential in an immediate sense. Now we fast forward to the 21st century, and climate change affects us. COVID affects us, but so does our interrelatedness on things like currency exchanges. So the first Asian contagion, people forget this, about 20 some years ago, was the sudden precipitous drop of the Thai baht that had within 24 hours a ripple effect that undermined currency and therefore investments and so forth. We are interdependent now on so many levels that exactly. So we can't just ignore these things anymore. I mean, for example, food security is becoming a global issue here. And climate change is exacerbating. It was already an issue. It's now becoming a much bigger issue. I'm told that, you know, at any one time in the world, there's not more than something like 90 days food for the world. We have integrated crop seasons and trade and so on global levels. So, you know, COVID has just made this super clear. So the idea of saying, at the end of the day, we will accept the junta with their purported effectiveness and their absence of legitimacy because we kind of want to keep trading. That's a fool's deal on a short-term basis that is going to come back and haunt us. And I think that's the inescapable problem.
Right. I mean, like, let's just say, you know, the last 10 or so years, the world has been notified that there was a genocide.
Yes.
And then, like, the world, you know, particularly the responsible, influential states, as well as the less influential member states of the UN, practically did nothing.
Right.
And so now we have a situation.
Well, to give them credit, that there was a humanitarian reaction. So what was done, my own country included, very significantly and to their credit, you know, wrote large checks and at least acknowledged it. But beyond that, I agree with you.
Well, I mean,
The contest for representation and you know, the push, in other words, the push to be seated as the genuine representative of the state of Myanmar at the United Nations, you know, it doesn't have a, you know, infinite possibilities. There are only a number of scenarios. Can you elaborate on what those few scenarios might be, you know, in the next several weeks or several months at the United Nations as the battle for being credentialed or recognized as a true representative of Myanmar rages on?
So in my view, you know, there are essentially three choices at the scenarios that would play out in the next week or so, actually, maybe the next month, because this committee of the General Assembly on credentials should meet, and they normally should make a decision. That would be the course of things, so that the state member of the United Nations can perform its functions for the legitimacy of the United Nations. It's made up of states, so you don't want to put one aside, right? And this session of the General Assembly is beginning, so they should be seated. They should have a voice. Now that means the three options are just there's only two competitors in this: the NUG and the junta. Do they essentially offer accord to the one or the other? So these are the two options, NUG or the junta. Or the third option is not to decide.
you mean like
They may, well, they might, so yeah, so one would be status quo, but status quo is de facto NUG because the ambassador has declared his essential position. My view is that procedurally, status quo is what should follow because there is no legal basis for one of the contesting parties. The junta is unable to establish, I mean, as I say, you or I or another group of thugs could show up. So there's no real basis for these other guys to show up. That's already problematic. And to place that in precedence in the sense of above the status quo makes no sense. But we're not looking for logical coherence here. And just in terms of the choices, I think that another likelihood is not only not to declare vacant, but simply not decide. It's like abstentions, or worse, you know, the way states vote is they vote yes or no, abstain, and the fourth one is they just walk out of the room. They absent themselves. So it is possible here that the Credentials Committee could even not meet and just leave the question unaddressed, right? So, but still, I think this is essentially three choices: NUG, the junta, or kind of leave it unresolved one way or another. Now, that leaving unresolved will come back. I think they will largely have to face the music of this around December.
Why December?
There are votes on resolutions from the General Assembly and so forth, and to kind of deprive the state of its ability to, which might be determinative in some cases, a 50% vote or whatever. You just ignore the state is problematical. But even there, they could, because this is how diplomat states are. If it's more problematical deciding, they will simply not decide, right? In terms of the consequences. I think what happens in this is time is bought by kicking the can, as we say, down the road. And then one will see, does the coherence of the effective control of the junta or what's going on with the NUG. I think this is why it matters also yesterday or the day before when NUG declared this people's defensive war. They are clearly stating there is no effective control and that contestation of it, but also declaring their assertiveness to engage in the competition of it. But very importantly, defensive. That they are not using the force.
I think that in the last couple of days that the National Unity Government has officially declared, what they call the defensive war. In other words, an all-out attempt to overthrow the brutal Burmese military regime. And what is your opinion about this development?
Well, plainly, to say nonviolence when you know that one side is armed to the teeth and the other is not armed at all, that is clearly almost a fait accompli. But nonetheless, that being said, so by the way, there is no duty of the and I want to say this very clearly. This idea of peaceful is not synonymous with nonviolence or with passivity.
No.
So even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights includes in its third preambular paragraph the phrase that says, if man is not to have resort to violence as the last course, then their human rights must be revoked. I'm paraphrasing. But even the Universal Declaration is premised on a natural inherent right of self-defense and of use of force in terms of rebellion. I mean, the American and the French republics are born on it and all the rest of it. So it is a nonsense to say that they must be passive in the use of violence against them. But concretely, what I think this partly means is that in the next 3 months, between the next week or two and December, it will be very interesting to know what happens on the ground. And this matters in many things. How sustainable is the junta in terms of its own economic resources? If money is deprived, from its access to its bank accounts, if it can't pay, if the COVID gets worse and they can't pay, you mentioned, if the ethnic armed groups and the NUG and the self-defense have successes. For example, if they can start to demonstrate degrees of effective control in some smaller population areas or even cities, this will be a very big development. Because remember, I said at the beginning, effectiveness, this recognition of reality on the ground is crucial and is actually the most essential of the norms, effective control. If the junta starts to be manifestly not only illegitimate, not acting for the benefit of the population, and not in effective control of it, but losing control then who are they? Then they're just a bunch of criminals.
Exactly.
Which, we
I
would
mean,
say
I
they
think-
are anyway. But
Myanmar military regime is widely considered a genocidal regime for its institutionalized persecution of the Rohingya people in western province of Burma called Rakhine. And how does this square the the UN and other national governments um, being seen as inclined to recognize the Burmese military now that there's no pretense of civilian led fragile democratic transition?
yes. Well, and it's very clear, therefore, that when the United Kingdom, they argue for their exchange of ambassadors, well, they didn't need to exchange their ambassadors, but this is another choice. This is their choice. But when they accept to, for example, displace the previous ambassador in London and they are placing their finger on the scales of global international relations and justice. They are siding with the junta. There is no doubt about it.
You mean
The British government.
by not spending
Yeah.
for they should have
Well, they could have declined to do anything, right? But they positively sided with, and then they try to hide
with
them.
the charging.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so, the final thoughts on what should be done by states that see these sympathetic people, democratic.
Well, so let me speak to my own government of Canada in this regard, because you know that our Parliament, you came to Canada and you spoke to our Parliament. Our Parliament adopted a resolution in both houses of Parliament, upper and lower, by unanimous vote to recognize the genocide. And with that, that included the personal vote of our Prime Minister and our Foreign Minister, our Deputy Prime Minister. With that comes state responsibility as a party to the Genocide Convention, that Canada should be active, not only declaratorily, but practically in the prevention of an ongoing or genocide at risk. And so it is not sufficient, and neither morally nor in law, only to write those checks to the humanitarian support, or to vote consistently in the Human Rights Council or in the UN General Assembly, or to make declarations as they from time to time do, or the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Ray, who makes good statements. But my point is, this is not sufficient. And the idea that they also give some money for the IIIM for some God knows when in the next century processes. So what they could be doing, and I would argue should be doing, even in terms of duty under the Prevention of Genocide, is they must be actively supporting and empowering the people. They must be supporting, in this case, for example, the Rohingya, but also the National Unity Government. They are, Canada was investing in supporting the, quote, democratization process. I say quote because I think it was not as much as what it claimed to be, and has failed. But if they are sincere in that and they were engaged in that, why would they not continue to support it? And in my view, would be even increase in the current precarious circumstance. So there is much that could be done, and with small resources. So relatively small amounts of money, not the amount that is required for humanitarian purposes, small amounts of money could substantially empower the democratic representatives, assist them with technical knowledge, assist them with educational needs, communications facilities. A lot of these people, as you know, even in the national unity government, are hiding, worried about their personal life. The ambassador in New York was threatened with assassination. So there's many things that could be done here. Even in international processes, Canada could join the case of the International Court of Justice and bring real political pressure, not just issue a statement online and show up with rhetorical sentiment, but actually assertive diplomatic engagement. So, that's my country. And Canada is not the closest country or with the greatest relations, but many others could be doing much more, certainly United Kingdom and many others. So I think this means a lot. And we have, by the way, we do have historical examples of this. If you look at how Algeria gained its independence in the 50s, it wasn't just through a revolutionary war. It was through diplomacy. It was through recognition. It was and it was extremely meaningful, and it was determinative. So and I acknowledge there are lots of problems in Algeria today, but I'm just saying that it's not like this is unheard of or unknown. So in short, there is so much more that could be done, that should be done, that would be normatively coherent and consistent, and ultimately would be in the interests of these states. Because God forbid, God knows what will happen if the junta succeeds in this. Then all of these, what I believe become pretensions, are entirely discredited. And then all bets are off. What happens?
So, any final thoughts on what energy and Burmese dissidents and revolutionaries should be doing within the international arena?
So I'm a little dismayed, but I'm not terribly surprised. The NUG, in my view, have been underplaying their hand. That they have the enormous benefit of having not perfect. I mean, we know the November 8th, 2020 elections were far from perfect. It's not even clear that they were very fair because, for example, the Rohingya were entirely excluded, just to take one example. But nonetheless, overwhelmingly, they were relatively free in the sense that there appears to be a genuine expression of the will of the people, grosso modo, in large measure. And that will of the people was overwhelming in favor of the NLD and through established orders. And there is a constitutional basis to construct even the NUG now. There's an argument about authority. So that's powerful. That's one of those three norms is on their side. And the purpose, and they've been making important statements, the purpose of using that authority for the benefit of the people, for the well-being and so forth, is also on their side. And even on their side has been the relative initial commitments to peaceful means, the popular movements, protests and so forth. But they are now at the point of, in my view, like the Universal Declaration says, an inherent right of rebellion. And I think they need to use that diplomatically, very assertively. They should be, and through their representation, not asking, they should be asserting. They would say, we are the state. They should demand to have the levers of authority over resources, bank accounts. They should be going to every international organization and I have actually suggested in the past, right now, declare immediately, issue letters on the part of the NUG that we accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. We wish to adhere to International Labor Organization treaties, which are relevant, and so forth. They could be doing all of that. They don't have to ask anyone. I'm not saying that they will be immediately accepted, but that challenges the international community themselves to say, okay, why would you reject this? Well, because there's this junta. So, in my view, this is a crucial moment. They've got a limited amount of time, and then they need to pursue.
Well, I mean, I think
why should the Chinese Communist leadership in Beijing be concerned about instability in Burma and the question of who will be recognized as the legitimate representative of Myanmar?
Dr. Zani, I would go further. I would say that even, for instance, China, in my experience, China is follows an orthodox approach to interests. And I think first of all, I think they cannot be happy about what is happening at Myanmar. It's not in their interest. But second of all, I think that they would prefer their overwhelming interest from an investment perspective, from access to the sea, from the Belt and Road Initiative and all the rest, is stability And that stability in the complex context of Myanmar should mean an accord between the ethnic groups, the people, and so forth. What they see now is a disaster.
Yeah.
It's a chaotic situation, and it's not one that is in their interest to maintain.
Yeah.
The risks associated with, the uncertainty associated with, is great.
Right.
So I don't think it's even just the West or democratic. It's, these, again, I go back to state
Even
interests.
state interests are not served by what is happening.
Exactly. India, Bangladesh.
Right.
I mean, they have Indonesia. I mean, the exploitation that they wish to pursue in the Bay of Bengal, in the free trade zones they're building, the deep sea ports, and all the rest of it. This is all, I mean, just to talk of that part of Burma, right? I mean, there's all the rest. So I think here there are hard-nosed, interest-based analyses, which would say that the better alternative is the NUG. Now, the NUG needs to make this case that they would not be ushering in chaos and breakdown and inability to govern. So here they have to show that they do work with the other groups, that these ideas that sound normatively consistent are actually operational.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's again where they need to kind of make that case convincingly. But that has longer legs. It has a vision, which is consistent with international interests and aspirations and all the rest of it. The junta, what is the vision of the junta? It's dead end. It is.
Professor John Packer, it's been extremely educational for me personally, and I'm sure for the viewers as well, to hear your, very best informed analyses on very critical and timely issues confronting not only the Burmese people, but the United Nations itself. This is all the time that we have for today, and thank you so much again for coming to share your thoughts on these vital issues. And I'm Zani, and you have been listening to the FORSEA Dialogue on democratic struggles across Asia. Thank you very much.